Imagine walking into a bank to take out your own money, only to be told it's too suspicious, and then watching their faces change when you say, "I own this bank." The first thing people noticed about Tanya Macmillan was her presence. Not her clothes, not her jewelry, her presence. She walked into the Buckhead branch of Sterling National Bank like someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly why. Her navy suit was pressed sharp enough to cut glass, her heels tapped with a steady rhythm across the marble floor, and she carried only a slim leather checkbook and a state-issued ID. It was just past 10:15 a.m. The morning rush had thinned, and only a few customers were scattered in the waiting area. Tanya's focus was set on one thing: a withdrawal. Not a casual 100 for groceries, but a figure that would make most people blink twice. She needed those funds for a property closing later that day, a project she'd been working toward for months. The teller, a sandy-haired young man named Brandon Keller, looked up from his computer as Tanya approached. He gave a polite smile, one of those quick flashes of teeth people are trained to show in customer service, and greeted her with the usual script. Tanya returned the greeting, passed over her ID and withdrawal slip, and stood waiting, hands folded neatly in front of her. Brandon's eyes landed on the amount, and something about his expression shifted. The friendly veneer thinned, replaced by a subtle but unmistakable wariness. His fingers hovered over the keyboard a beat too long. Then, without making eye contact, he said, "I'm going to need to run some additional verification. Could you please take a seat for a few minutes?" Tanya glanced at the clock. "How long is this going to take?" "It shouldn't be long," Brandon replied, but his tone had lost its warmth. "We just have to be sure." She walked to the lobby seating, 4 cushioned chairs along the far wall, and sat down. Her gaze swept the branch. 2 other tellers, a loan officer behind glass, and a couple of customers finishing up paperwork. Conversations were hushed, but Tanya could feel the occasional glance in her direction. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. Brandon moved between his station and a side office, sometimes on the phone, sometimes typing. Not once did he come back to update her. Tanya kept her posture straight, her handbag resting lightly against her side, but her jaw tightened ever so slightly. She'd dealt with unnecessary roadblocks before, but the clock was ticking on her closing. Finally, at just over the 20-minute mark, Brandon reappeared. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a woman in her late 40s with a sharp bob haircut and a charcoal blazer. Her name tag read Cynthia Morales, branch manager. They stopped in front of Tanya's chair. Cynthia's smile was polite but tight, her voice low but firm. "Ms. Macmillan, we've reviewed your request. Unfortunately, due to the size of the withdrawal and certain account security flags, we won't be able to process it at this time." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Security flags? This is my account." "I understand," Cynthia replied, clasping her hands. "But our policy requires us to ensure funds of this size are being withdrawn under the proper circumstances. I hope you understand. It's for everyone's protection." Tanya's eyes didn't waver. "So you're denying me access to my own money?" "It's not a denial," Cynthia said quickly. "It's a precaution." The distinction was meaningless. Tanya knew it, and so did they. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fumble for explanations. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, took a measured breath, and asked a simple question. "Do you have a pen and some paper?" Cynthia hesitated, but eventually gestured toward Brandon, who fetched a ballpoint pen and a notepad. Tanya took them, placed the notepad on her knee, and began writing. Each stroke was calm, deliberate. She tore the page from the pad, folded it once, and handed it to Cynthia. "You might want to Google that," Tanya said evenly. Cynthia looked puzzled, but opened the folded paper. On it was a single line. Tanya's full name, followed by 3 letters in capital print. CEO. When Cynthia looked up, Tanya added, "I'm the majority shareholder of Sterling National Bank. In fact, I own this branch, and the one you transferred from before you took this position." For a moment, no one moved. Brandon's face paled, his eyes flicking to Cynthia like he was waiting for instructions. The air between them was heavier now, not from raised voices, but from the quiet weight of realization. But the reveal was only the beginning. The scramble to undo their mistake was about to make the whole branch even more uncomfortable. Cynthia stood there, gripping the note between her fingers like it was suddenly burning through the paper. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out right away. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, his eyes bouncing from Tanya to the manager, unsure if he should excuse himself or stay put. Tanya didn't press. She simply waited, letting the silence work in her favor. There was power in not rushing to fill the gap, in letting the other person realize just how badly they'd miscalculated. Cynthia cleared her throat, finally managing, "I'll need a moment to confirm this. Take your time." Tanya replied calmly, folding her hands again. Her tone was almost pleasant. Almost. But anyone listening closely would catch the steel beneath it. Cynthia turned on her heel and walked briskly toward her office at the far end of the branch. Brandon lingered a second too long, then muttered, "Excuse me," before following her inside. The glass door shut behind them, and the muffled sound of their conversation drifted out in broken pieces. Tanya couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. CEO, verify, shareholder. Impossible. A man in a grey hoodie at the loan officer's desk glanced at Tanya, then quickly looked away when she met his gaze. A woman near the whispered something to her friend, their heads leaning close together. Tanya knew what they were thinking. They were trying to piece together a story from fragments they'd overheard, the way people do when they sense drama but don't know the full picture. Inside the office, Cynthia was already pulling up internal databases. Brandon hovered beside her, watching the screen as names and account details appeared. It didn't take long. Tanya Macmillan wasn't just a customer. She wasn't even just a big client. She was the registered majority shareholder of Sterling National Bank. Her acquisition of the controlling stake had been part of a regional merger barely 3 months earlier. Brandon whispered something that made Cynthia's shoulders stiffen. "Well," she said, keeping her voice low, "this is awkward." Back in the lobby, Tanya checked the time on her phone. She still had an hour before she needed to leave for her property closing, but every passing minute was another test of her patience. She thought about calling her attorney, but no, she'd give them the space to fix this themselves. The lesson would hit harder that way. A door creaked open, and Brandon re-emerged, looking like he'd just been told he'd lost his job. He approached the counter, avoiding Tanya's eyes as he began typing again. Cynthia followed a few steps behind, her expression neutral, but her cheeks flushed. "Miss Macmillan," she began, "we've verified your identity and position with the bank. There seems to have been a miscommunication on our part." Tanya tilted her head. "Miscommunication?" "Yes," Cynthia said quickly. "The withdrawal can be processed immediately. I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Tanya stood and walked back to the counter, her heels clicking against the tile. She didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, a reminder that she wasn't the one scrambling here. "Before you process it," she said, "I'd like to know, what exactly was the reason for the initial delay?" Brandon's throat bobbed. "It was a policy for transactions above a certain amount." "Policy?" Tanya repeated, as if tasting the word. "Does that policy involve leaving a client in the lobby for 20 minutes without so much as an update?" Brandon glanced at Cynthia, who stepped in. "No, it doesn't. That was poor handling on our part." Tanya let the silence hang again before saying, "Let's go ahead with the withdrawal." Brandon nodded, tapping at the keyboard with a little too much focus. Bills began sliding through the counting machine behind the counter, the crisp sound cutting through the low murmur of the branch. He stacked the money neatly, double-checked the total, and placed it in a discreet envelope. When he handed it over, Tanya didn't immediately take it. She looked at Brandon, then at Cynthia, and said, "I've built my career on 2 things, knowing my worth, and never letting anyone else define it for me. You might remember that next time a client sits in that chair." Cynthia's lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Understood, Ms. Macmillan." Tanya took the envelope, slipped it into her handbag, and reached for her checkbook and ID. The transaction was technically complete, but the moment wasn't over. There was still the matter of how they'd try to recover their footing. But what they offered her next would be even more telling than the delay itself, and Tanya already knew her answer before they spoke. Tanya didn't head straight for the door. She stayed put, not out of hesitation, but because she could see the gears turning in their heads. She'd been in too many boardrooms to miss the signs, the quick glances between staff, the subtle nod toward a back office, the quiet conference that meant someone was trying to salvage a situation before it spiraled any further. From her chair in the lobby, Tanya had a clear view of the entire branch. She noticed details most customers would overlook: the faint scuff marks on the lower half of the glass doors, the way the loan officer nervously shuffled papers just to avoid looking in her direction, the subtle hum of the counting machine still running somewhere in the back. It wasn't noise she focused on. It was behavior. People showed you who they were when they thought they had the upper hand. And right now, both Brandon and Cynthia were doing mental gymnastics to figure out how to present themselves as helpful professionals, rather than the gatekeepers who had just tried to deny her access to her own funds. Her phone buzzed in her bag. It was a text from her real estate agent in Savannah, confirming that the closing attorney had everything ready for the afternoon meeting. Tanya typed back a quick, "on track," even though technically she was still here, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She thought back to her early days in business, when she'd first stepped into high-value negotiations. Back then, she'd been on the receiving end of long pauses, sideways glances, and those thinly veiled tests of credibility. They'd assumed she didn't belong at the table. That same quiet skepticism was what she'd just walked into here. Except now, she wasn't some newcomer trying to prove herself. She was the one holding the majority stake in the bank's entire operation. The irony wasn't lost on her. Through the corner of her eye, Tanya caught Cynthia reappearing, this time without Brandon. The manager carried herself differently now, a little straighter, her smile a little too rehearsed. She approached slowly, as though walking up to a guest she'd accidentally offended at a dinner party. "Ms. Macmillan," Cynthia began, "we want to ensure your banking experience reflects the standards we hold ourselves to. Given your position with Sterling, I'd like to personally offer you access to our private client services." Tanya didn't miss the way she'd hesitated on position, like she'd almost said ownership, but thought better of it. "And what would that involve?" Tanya asked, her tone even. "It means you'd have a dedicated relationship manager," Cynthia explained. "No wait times, direct contact for all transactions, concierge-level service for personal and business needs. We'd also be able to handle large withdrawals without the delays you experienced today." Tanya leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "So I'd get what I should have received in the first place?" Cynthia's eyes flickered, but she kept her smile in place. "Well, yes, but with additional benefits." It was tempting in a way. Tanya had always believed in creating systems that cut through red tape. But this wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about principle. She could accept their offer, walk out with a smoother process, and never have to deal with a scene like this again. But that would leave the underlying problem untouched for everyone else who didn't own the building they were standing in. "I appreciate the offer," Tanya said finally, "but I think I'll pass. What I would like is to know what changes you'll make so that no other client experiences the same kind of treatment I did today." Cynthia's smile wavered. "We'll review our protocols." "That's a start," Tanya said, gathering her things. "I'll check back in a month and see how that review is going." She rose from the chair, the conversation effectively over on her terms. She wasn't interested in making them feel small. She just wanted them to remember this moment the next time someone sat where she had been sitting. But before Tanya could leave, a voice from across the lobby caught her attention, and it would turn a private incident into something everyone in the room would remember. Tanya turned toward the voice. It came from a middle-aged man in a dark green windbreaker standing near the loan officer's desk. He had a quiet but firm tone, the kind people use when they've been holding something back, but can't anymore. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, addressing Tanya. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did you say you own this bank?" The lobby seemed to pause with him. Even the loan officer, who had been avoiding Tanya's gaze for the past half hour, stopped shuffling papers. All eyes shifted her way again. "That's correct," Tanya replied, her voice steady. The man shook his head slowly. "Well, I'll be honest. I thought I saw something strange when you came in." You walked like you knew the place better than anyone here. I guess now I know why. Before Tanya could respond, Cynthia's voice cut in quickly. Sir, if you could— But the man raised a hand, not to be rude, but to keep his thought moving. I've been banking here for 12 years. If they can treat the owner like this, I can only imagine what they'd do to me. That landed harder than anything Tanya had said so far. Cynthia's jaw tightened, but she forced a light chuckle. We value all of our clients equally, sir. This was simply a misunderstanding. The man didn't look convinced, but he let it drop, turning back toward the loan officer's desk. Tanya caught the faintest smirk tug at the corner of his mouth, not out of amusement, but from the satisfaction of seeing someone speak up. Cynthia turned back to Tanya, her voice lower now. Would you like to step into my office so we can discuss this privately? Tanya weighed it for a moment, then nodded. Sure. The walk to Cynthia's office was short, but the energy was different. Earlier, Tanya had been summoned there by their authority. Now she was walking in because she allowed it. Cynthia closed the glass door behind them, gesturing toward the leather chair across from her desk. I want to start by apologizing again, Cynthia began, settling into her seat. I understand how this looked, and how it felt. I can assure you this isn't how we operate. Tanya studied her for a beat. You've been with Sterling for how long? Just over a year, Cynthia answered. Before that, I managed a branch in Tampa. Then you know the importance of recognizing patterns, Tanya said. If a client walks in, presents valid ID, and requests a withdrawal from their own account, the process should be straightforward. The fact that it wasn't means something in your system, whether policy or people, is broken. Cynthia's pen tapped lightly against her desk, an unconscious rhythm. I understand. I'll review today's events with our staff and make adjustments. That's fine, Tanya replied. But I want it on record, not because of who I am, but because the next person who sits in that lobby shouldn't have to pull rank to be treated fairly. Cynthia's eyes flickered briefly, a hint that she knew this was about more than a single incident. Understood. Tanya leaned forward slightly. Do you have quarterly client feedback reports for this branch? Yes, Cynthia said. They're reviewed at the regional level. Send me a copy from the last 2 quarters, Tanya said plainly. And I'll expect to see the next one when it's compiled. Cynthia nodded, though her posture was just stiff enough to reveal she wasn't used to taking directives from a client, or, in this case, the client. The conversation ended without a handshake. Tanya stood, opened the office door, and stepped back into the lobby. She could feel the shift in the room. Customers pretending not to listen, employees pretending to be busy. She didn't need to say anything else to them. The point had been made. Cynthia followed a few steps behind, but this time she didn't try to lead. She returned to her counter, speaking briefly to Brandon, who still looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tanya glanced toward the man in the windbreaker, who gave her a single approving nod. She acknowledged it with a slight lift of her chin before heading toward the exit. But just as her hand reached for the glass door, a sudden thought made her stop. There was one last thing she needed to do before walking out. Tanya let her hand hover over the door handle for a moment before turning back toward the counter. She could leave, sure. She had her money. She had made her point. But walking out now meant the incident would end quietly, tucked away as an embarrassing memory for the staff, and nothing more. That wasn't enough. Not this time. She walked back toward Brandon's station. The air in the branch seemed to tighten again, like everyone realized they were about to witness a second round. Brandon straightened instinctively, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Is there something else I can help you with, Ms. McMillan? He asked, voice just a shade too cautious. Yes, Tanya said evenly, resting her handbag on the counter. I'd like a receipt for today's withdrawal, itemized with the exact time the request was made and the exact time it was processed. Brandon blinked. Of course. Give me a moment. She watched him type, each keystroke sharp against the keyboard. And make sure it shows the delay, she added. His fingers paused for just a second before continuing. Yes, ma'am. While he worked, Tanya's attention shifted to the other employees. The loan officer was watching her through the reflection in the glass partition, pretending to shuffle papers again. A young woman near the 8 quickly averted her eyes when Tanya glanced her way. Customers had stopped pretending they weren't paying attention. Some openly followed the exchange now. When Brandon handed her the receipt, Tanya folded it neatly and slipped it into her bag. She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know why I asked for that?" Brandon hesitated. "For your records?" "No," Tanya said. "Because paper doesn't forget. And neither should you." Cynthia had reappeared at the edge of the counter, her arms crossed loosely. "Is there anything else we can do to make this right today?" she asked, her voice careful, measured. Tanya met her gaze. "Yes, I'd like to speak to the Regional Operations Director." "Now." Cynthia's posture stiffened, but she didn't argue. "I'll make the call." As she walked toward her office, Tanya turned back to Brandon. "In your role, you're the face of this bank for every client who steps up to this counter. That means you set the tone. The delay today wasn't just policy, it was a choice. Remember that the next time you decide who gets treated like they belong here, and who doesn't." Brandon swallowed hard, his voice low. "I understand." Minutes later, Cynthia returned, holding out her phone. "I have Mr. Reynolds from Regional on the line." Tanya took the phone. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Tanya Macmillan. I'm calling from the Buckhead branch, the one I own. We had a situation this morning that I think you should be aware of." The conversation was direct. She laid out the facts, the time she arrived, the request she made, the delay, the refusal, the eventual reveal. No embellishments, no raised voice, just a clear timeline of events. On the other end, Reynolds apologized repeatedly, promising a review of procedures and a follow-up with her directly. Tanya ended the call with a simple, "I'll expect to hear from you within the week." Handing the phone back to Cynthia, she said, "That's all I needed today." Cynthia nodded, but the look in her eyes was complicated. Part frustration, part respect, and part the sinking realization that this would be talked about long after Tanya left the building. Tanya picked up her handbag again, turning toward the customers still watching. For a brief second, she considered saying something to them. A reminder that sometimes the only way to fix a system is to call it out where everyone can see. But she didn't need to. Her presence had done the talking. But even Tanya didn't expect what would happen just outside those glass doors, where the incident was about to take on a life of its own beyond the bank's walls. The moment Tanya pushed through the glass doors, the warmth of the late morning Georgia sun hit her face, but so did the sound of voices. A small knot of people stood just outside, clustered near the corner of the building. They weren't protesters, just everyday customers who had been inside earlier or had drifted in from the sidewalk after catching wind of something unusual happening in the branch. One of them, a woman in her 60s wearing a denim jacket, stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am. You're the lady they were giving a hard time to in there, right?" Tanya paused. "That depends. What exactly have you heard?" The woman glanced at the others, then back to Tanya. "We heard you own the bank. Is that true?" There was no point in softening it. "Yes, I'm the majority shareholder of Sterling National. That's my branch." A ripple went through the group. A man in a Braves cap whistled softly. "So they tried to block you from taking your own money? From your own bank?" "That's exactly what happened," Tanya said. The woman in the denim jacket shook her head. "You kept your cool in there. I was sitting in the back. I saw the whole thing. Most people would have lost their temper." Tanya smiled faintly. Sometimes the quietest reaction makes the biggest impact. From behind her, the glass doors opened again. Cynthia stepped outside, her blazer buttoned, her expression carefully neutral. She stopped when she saw the small crowd. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered toward Tanya, as if silently asking her not to say more. But Tanya wasn't interested in keeping the story locked inside those walls. "To be clear," Tanya said, projecting her voice just enough for the group to hear, "this isn't about me. I can handle myself. But what happened in there shouldn't happen to anyone, whether they own the building or just opened their first account yesterday." The man in the cap nodded. "People need to hear that." Cynthia stepped closer, her tone polite but taut. "Miss Macmillan, perhaps we can continue this discussion privately." "We already had that conversation," Tanya interrupted, still calm but unyielding. "This one isn't about policy meetings. It's about the fact that respect shouldn't depend on knowing who someone is before you give it." A young woman in a floral dress, who had been standing toward the back, raised her phone. Would you mind if I recorded what you're saying? I think people would want to hear it. Tanya hesitated for just a second, weighing the consequences. She knew a video could take the story far beyond this street corner. And maybe that was the point. Go ahead, she said. The woman hit record, and Tanya spoke clearly, without theatrics. This morning, I walked into a branch of a bank I own to withdraw money from my own account. I presented my ID, followed the process, and was told my request was suspicious. After a 20-minute delay, it took revealing my ownership of the branch to get my transaction approved. That's not just a policy issue. That's about perception, assumptions, and the way people decide, often in an instant, who deserves access and who doesn't. If I hadn't owned this bank, I might still be sitting in that lobby right now. By the time she finished, 2 more people had stepped closer, listening. Someone muttered, "Wow," under their breath. Cynthia's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her smile frozen. She waited until Tanya lowered her voice, then said, "We will be addressing this internally." "You should," Tanya replied. "But don't forget it's already being addressed out here." The woman with the phone smiled, glancing at her screen. "This is going online right now." Tanya didn't flinch. She didn't have to. She knew what was coming. Conversations, debates, maybe even backlash. But she also knew the truth was simple enough to stand on its own. She turned back toward the sidewalk, ready to walk away. Her withdrawal was secure in her handbag. Her schedule still allowed her to make the closing in Savannah. Yet she couldn't help but think the real closing had already happened here. A closing of assumptions, at least for the people who had witnessed it. But by the time Tanya reached her car, she'd have no idea that within hours, this short exchange outside the bank would be replayed thousands of times across the internet, and that the story would take on a life of its own. By the time Tanya merged onto the freeway toward Savannah, her phone had already begun vibrating in short, rapid bursts. Text messages, missed calls, and notification banners stacked one after another. At first, she thought it might be from her real estate team checking on the status of the closing. But when she glanced at the screen at a red light just outside Macon, she realized the flood wasn't from business contacts. It was from friends, colleagues, and even a few reporters she hadn't spoken to in years. One text from her longtime friend, journalist Patrice Bowen, stood out. "Girl, you're trending. Call me now." Tanya pulled into a gas station, parked near the far edge of the lot, and hit the call button. Patrice answered before the first ring was done. "Do you realize your face is all over my feed?" Patrice's voice was quick, almost incredulous. "Someone posted a video of you outside the bank. It's already at 20,000 views, and that was an hour ago." Tanya exhaled slowly. "That didn't take long." "No, it didn't," Patrice said. "And the comments? Whoa. People are going in on that branch. Customers are sharing their own stories. You might want to brace yourself. This is going to be bigger than you think." Tanya thanked her and promised to call back later, then hung up. For a moment, she just sat there, the low hum of passing traffic in the background. She had known the video could spread, but she hadn't expected it to catch fire this fast. Back in Buckhead, inside the bank she had just left, the staff were already feeling the heat. Brandon sat stiffly at his station, fielding calls from clients who had seen the video and wanted clarification. Cynthia had been on the phone with Regional for nearly 40 minutes, her voice low but tense. When she finally emerged from her office, she pulled Brandon aside. "You need to stick to the script. No opinions, no explanations. Just tell them we're aware of the situation and that it's being addressed internally." Brandon nodded, though his face was pale. "Are we in trouble?" Cynthia didn't answer directly. "Just do your job. The less we say right now, the better." At the regional headquarters, the story had already reached the desk of Sterling National's executive leadership. Screenshots of the video were being circulated in internal emails. The PR team drafted statements while legal reviewed whether any policies had been breached in a way that could be interpreted as discriminatory. The higher-ups weren't just concerned about the optics. They were worried about the potential regulatory fallout if this incident gained more traction. Meanwhile, Tanya kept driving. She wasn't glued to her phone, but she couldn't ignore the way it kept buzzing in her handbag. A voice message from a board member she knew well confirmed what she suspected. We're convening an unscheduled meeting tomorrow. Be ready to talk about what happened. She smiled wryly. Of course we are, she murmured to herself. What intrigued Tanya most wasn't the video itself. She'd spoken plainly, without theatrics. It was the public's reaction. People weren't just talking about her owning the bank. They were talking about how calmly she had handled the situation. Some praised her restraint, others argued she should have been more confrontational. But the majority seemed struck by the absurdity of a person being denied their own funds simply because of how they were perceived in the moment. By the time she pulled into Savannah that afternoon, local media outlets were already calling the incident the Buckhead Bank Standoff, a name Tanya found both ridiculous and strangely fitting. She parked in front of the law office where the property closing was set to take place, pausing for a moment before stepping out of the car. This part of her day had nothing to do with the bank drama, but she could feel the weight of it following her into the meeting. Still, she signed the papers, secured the deal, and shook hands with her agent. Business moved forward. Outside, she glanced at her phone again. The video had passed 100,000 views. She wasn't surprised, but she was curious about how the bank would respond once the public pressure became impossible to ignore. But what Tanya didn't yet realize was that the scramble inside Sterling National had already shifted from damage control to full-blown containment, and that meant some people were willing to bend the truth to protect themselves. The next morning, Tanya's phone rang before sunrise. She'd barely sipped her coffee when the caller ID lit up with a number she recognized, the chair of Sterling National's board, Malcolm Pierce. He wasn't the kind of man to call without a purpose, and certainly not at 6:15 in the morning. Tanya, he began, his voice clipped. I assume you've seen what's happening online. I have, Tanya said, keeping her tone even. There's pressure from several directions, regulators, the press, even some of our largest depositors. The PR team is preparing a public statement, but, he paused, choosing his words carefully. They'd like your cooperation to keep this from escalating. Tanya took a slow breath. Define cooperation. They're drafting a version of events that downplays certain aspects, Malcolm explained. The aim is to present this as an unfortunate procedural delay, not a case of personal bias. She leaned back in her chair. So you want me to let them rewrite the truth? I'm asking you to consider the long-term stability of the bank, Malcolm said. Sometimes protecting the brand means telling the truth so you can fix the problem. Tanya cut in. There was a pause. I'll tell them you're not agreeing to the statement as written, Malcolm said finally. But Tanya, this is going to make some people very uncomfortable. Good, she replied, ending the call. By mid-morning, Tanya decided to return to the Buckhead branch. She wasn't there to argue. She wanted to be seen. She parked in the same spot as before, walked through the same glass doors, and found the lobby noticeably quieter than usual. The air felt heavier, like everyone was hyper-aware of what had happened the day before. Brandon was at his station, but when he saw her, he froze for just a split second before standing a little straighter. Cynthia emerged from her office almost immediately, her expression set in a careful, practiced smile. Miss McMillan, she said, welcome back. We've made some immediate changes to our handling of high-value withdrawals. That's good to hear, Tanya replied. But I came today for a different reason. She stepped aside, revealing a man and woman who had followed her in. Both were dressed in business attire, each carrying a leather folder. This is Darren Cole from Regional Compliance and Janet Price from our Corporate Communications team. They're here to observe how this branch operates and to speak with staff. Cynthia's smile didn't falter, but Tanya caught the faint tension in her jaw. The visit wasn't hostile, but it was thorough. Darren quietly asked Brandon and the other tellers about transaction procedures. Janet spent time with Cynthia, reviewing the branch's customer service training materials. Tanya didn't hover. She simply took a seat in the lobby, watching the process with the same calm she'd shown the day before. It didn't take long for the first customer to approach her. A young man in a navy hoodie and jeans stopped by her chair. I saw the video, he said quietly. I just wanted to say, thank you. Stuff like that happens more than people realize. Tanya gave him a small nod. Then maybe now it'll happen less. Over the next hour, 2 more customers stopped to speak with her. None of them raised their voices or made a scene, but each exchange carried the same undercurrent: relief that someone had stood up in a way that couldn't be ignored. By the time Darren and Janet wrapped up their review, Cynthia approached Tanya once more. This time her tone was softer. "We'll be implementing new steps starting today. Clients withdrawing large sums will be escorted to a private office to complete their transactions, regardless of the amount or their account history. No more lobby delays." "That's a step," Tanya said. "Let's see if it sticks." She left the branch without further comment, but this time the silence in the room wasn't from skepticism. It was from the quiet acknowledgement that things had changed. Outside, a local TV crew was waiting on the sidewalk. Tanya didn't avoid them. She stopped, answered a few direct questions, and left them with one closing line: "Respect shouldn't be a privilege you earn. It should be the starting point in every interaction." The cameras caught it all. By that evening, her words were leading the local news. But even as the bank scrambled to repair its public image, the online conversation was already shifting. From the details of Tanya's withdrawal to a much bigger question about how authority and respect are granted in everyday life. By Friday morning, the video had crossed 2 million views. It wasn't just on social media anymore. Cable news segments, online opinion columns, and radio talk shows had picked it up. Some were framing it as a story about corporate culture and outdated banking practices. Others were calling it a case study in unconscious bias. And a few, predictably, were trying to spin it into something political. Tanya had spent the last 2 days keeping her schedule as normal as possible. She wasn't hiding from the attention, but she wasn't chasing it either. She still had properties to manage, meetings to attend, and employees to support. But wherever she went, people seemed to recognize her now. At a coffee shop in Savannah, the barista leaned over the counter. "I just want to say, that was legendary," he whispered. At the airport, a woman in a business suit stopped her near security. "I showed that clip to my teenage daughter. Told her, this is how you handle yourself when someone doubts you." Not all the feedback was supportive. Tanya's inbox had its share of anonymous messages accusing her of making a scene or trying to ruin careers. She didn't waste energy responding. She knew those voices weren't really about her. They were about discomfort. People often reacted that way when a story forced them to rethink the rules they'd always accepted. Meanwhile, Sterling National's leadership was on overdrive. They'd issued an official statement acknowledging a breakdown in client service at one of our branches and promising a comprehensive review of procedures. Tanya noted how carefully the wording avoided specifics. She understood why. The bank had to protect itself legally, but she also knew the public could read between the lines. On Thursday evening, Patrice called again. "You're in the Sunday edition of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution," she said, almost laughing. "Full-page feature. They're framing it as a moment of quiet authority," Tanya chuckled. "Quiet authority? That's a polite way to say I didn't yell." "It's the truth, though," Patrice replied. "You made your point without losing control. People remember that." By the weekend, the conversation online had shifted. It wasn't just about Tanya anymore, it was about everyday stories. Under the hashtag #BankRespect, people were sharing their own experiences of being second-guessed, stalled, or dismissed in situations where they should have been treated with basic courtesy. Some of the accounts were about banks, others were about restaurants, hiring interviews, even hospitals. The details were different, but the core frustration was the same: the feeling of having to prove your legitimacy before being taken seriously. Tanya read through dozens of these posts one night, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. They weren't all angry. Some were hopeful, pointing out moments where a single respectful employee had changed an entire experience. But the sheer volume of them told her this was bigger than a single branch or a single transaction. She started thinking about her next board meeting. Maybe it was time for Sterling to take this further, to look at how every client interaction could be designed to avoid these moments altogether, not as a PR gesture, but as a real shift. The following Monday, Tanya received a message from Darren Cole, the compliance officer who'd visited the branch with her. "We've finalized the procedural changes," it read. "I'd like to discuss additional training programs for all frontline staff. Would you be open to helping us shape them?" She stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Yes, let's make it worth the effort. The media attention would fade eventually. That was inevitable. But Tanya was determined that the lesson wouldn't fade with it. She wasn't interested in being a viral headline. She wanted the kind of change that couldn't be reversed once the spotlight moved on. But before she could push for that change at the next board meeting, Tanya had one last thing to say to the public, and it would leave them with a message they wouldn't forget. It was a clear Tuesday morning when Tanya sat down in her home office to record a short message. No production crew, no special lighting, just her laptop camera and the sunlight spilling through the blinds behind her. She knew the media cycle was already moving on. A different story was catching headlines now, but she also knew the audience who had followed her experience was still there, waiting to see how she'd close the chapter. She hit record and leaned slightly toward the camera. "I've heard from hundreds of you over the past week," she began. "Some of you shared similar stories. Some of you wrote just to say you were proud of how I handled myself. And some of you, well, you didn't agree with how I did it at all. That's fine. We're not always going to agree on the best way to handle a difficult moment." Her tone stayed warm, conversational, as if she were speaking to a friend over coffee. "But here's the truth I've learned in 30 years of running businesses," she continued. "Respect is the only real currency that matters. You can have money in the bank, you can have titles, you can have influence, but if the people you deal with every day can't start from a place of respect, you're going to spend your life paying a debt you didn't owe in the first place." She paused, letting the words breathe. What happened at the bank wasn't new. It happens in different ways, in different places, to different people. The only difference this time was that I happened to own the building. That fact changed the ending. But it shouldn't take that kind of leverage to be treated fairly. Everyone should get the benefit of the doubt before they have to prove they deserve it. Tanya leaned back slightly, her voice steady but firm. "So here's my ask. If you're watching this and you work with the public, remember that every person who walks through your door is someone's mother, father, child, or friend. They have a story you can't see. Treat them as if that story matters. Because it does." She tapped the desk lightly with her fingertips, a habit she had when making a final point. "And if you're on the other side, if you're the one being doubted, delayed, or dismissed, don't let someone else's perception rewrite your value. Stay calm, hold your ground, and make sure the truth gets heard. You don't have to shout to be heard clearly." Her expression softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "This isn't just about banking. It's about every interaction we have, every decision we make when we meet someone new. You have the power to make someone feel smaller, or to make them feel seen. Choose wisely." She ended the recording with a final line meant for the people who had been following from the start. "If this message matters to you, share it. Talk about it. Bring it up the next time you see something that doesn't look right. Change doesn't happen in conference rooms. It happens in the moments we decide not to look away." Tanya uploaded the video, expecting it to quietly make its way through the same channels that had amplified her story the week before. By the end of the day, it had been shared by community leaders, workplace trainers, and even a few bank executives she didn't know personally. Her calm delivery and refusal to frame the story as a personal victory made it harder for people to dismiss as a stunt. In her next board meeting, she pushed for the staff training initiative Darren had mentioned, not just for her branches, but for every sterling national location in the country. The motion passed unanimously, and while she knew policies didn't change hearts overnight, she also knew this was a starting point. For Tanya, the takeaway was simple. The real win wasn't that she got her money or that the video went viral. The win was knowing the next person who walked into that branch, or any branch, might walk out with their dignity intact, whether they owned the building or not. And before closing her laptop for the day, she added a line to her calendar as a personal reminder. Check in, keep the pressure on, never let them forget. If you believe respect should be the starting point in every interaction, subscribe for more stories that show what it looks like in real life and how to make it the standard, not the exception.